Today is Saturday, May 11th. If you've been regularly tuning into the Newsworthy, you know we've been covering key developments in the war in Gaza and the protests happening on college campuses here in the U.S. But today we're taking a closer look at what the protesters really want and why it's not as black and white as it's often made out to be. Plus, we discuss the range of reactions and arguments about the campus protests across the political spectrum. My guest today is Isaac Saul. He's the founder of Tangle, an independent, nonpartisan politics newsletter that summarizes the best arguments from both the right and left on the big debates of the day. He also hosts the Tangle Podcast. So let's get into it. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Isaac Saul, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thanks for having me, Erica. Glad to be here.
So my first question is really just about how we talk about these protesters. Do you think it's correct to be calling protesters, pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel?
I think generally speaking, it's fair to describe a lot of these protests as pro-Palestine, or maybe even more accurately anti-Israel. I think, they fundamentally are out in numbers because they oppose Israel's war in Gaza, the incursion in Gaza. They describe it as a genocide, and I think are seeing images coming out of Gaza that are, objectively horrifying and feel like they need to do something and act on it. The reason I say maybe anti-Israel instead of pro-Palestine is just because I think the movement is part anti-war and also, genuinely interested in pushing back on the construction of Israel, the Israeli project. I mean, when you look at what a lot of the organizing groups are calling for, it's not just for a ceasefire. It's for divestment from Israel. It's for, a free Palestine from the river to the sea. It is a lot of things that I think are fundamentally constructed in a way to say we oppose the state of Israel and we don't want our university to be associated with it. So it is a hard thing to label and hard to talk about any group of protesters in really broad terms, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Even still, I imagine there's a wide variety of opinions and actions within each group of protests. How much have you seen is truly violent and harassment versus peaceful protest?
Yeah, I mean, look, my read on the current situation is that the vast majority of these protests consist of things like encampments, building occupations, singing songs, chants. Some of these protests you see at places like Columbia or Penn University, which is right around the corner from where I live in Philadelphia. I mean, you can find Passover services, you can find art workshops and guest speakers. Certainly some Jewish students are feeling intimidated by the ways the protesters are going about setting up these encampments or asking people for identification or wristbands to get through certain parts of campus. We've seen clashes, some of which have been provoked by pro-Israel protesters, some of which have been provoked by really violent, scary chanting from the pro-Palestine or anti-Israel protesters who are, calling for bombing Tel Aviv or going back to Poland or whatever. And there's been a lot of that in the news, but I think for the most part, these have been pretty peaceful protests, especially compared to what we saw in the 60s, for example. And I also think it's worth remembering that this is happening on a minority of campuses. There's 6,000 college campuses in America. Maybe 150 have had documented protests like this. I just saw a survey today that 8% of college students say they've participated in the protests on either side. So this is not something that is totally taking over every college in America. I think there's just been a lot of media hype around it.
Yeah, I know you've talked previously about the protests maybe getting more attention than they deserve, but on the other side, there is an impact to a lot of students. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best argument that these are really important things and deserve a lot of coverage is that, even if this is a small number of schools and even if it's a small number of protesters or students participating, they're doing a really effective job, the protesters are, of making this the central thing that's happening on campus. So they invite in this big media frenzy. Maybe, classes are getting canceled or finals are getting canceled or buildings are inaccessible. And so it's a genuine, obstruction for daily life for a lot of the college students who are out there. I also think it's getting a lot of attention because a lot of these protests are happening on the most elite campuses in the country, which obviously produce a lot of our future leaders, be it politicians or lawyers or CEOs of corporations. And so for older Americans who are thinking about the future of the country or younger Americans who are college-aged, it's important to understand that this up-and-coming generation holds certain political views or feels really strongly about this issue. And of course, we have an election coming up. And one big question mark is whether college students are going to show up and support Joe Biden, or they're going to protest vote or vote for somebody else or vote for Donald Trump. And I think these protests are tied to that directly, which draws a lot of interest, rightfully so. I mean, I think college students will have an impact on the 2024 election.
We can be open about your public stance that you're someone who supports Israel and is calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. So it's not necessarily, one side or the other.
Yeah, it's really hard to talk about this issue because everybody wants it to be very black and white and simple. And the reality is, there are Zionists who believe that, they have a right to turn Gaza into a parking lot based on what happened on October 7th. I mean, there are public officials in the Israeli government who are basically saying that. And then there are Zionists like me, who I consider myself a liberal Zionist, which I think is an ideology set of its own, that I believe the state of Israel should exist. I believe in the mission and the project of Israel. But I also think that what's happening right now is dangerous long-term and bad long-term, not just for Palestinians, which is self-evident, but for Israelis, for Jews across the globe. The views on this span the gamut. And, I've even interviewed Egyptian Muslim Arabs who are pro-Israel and actually support the project of Israel and are, vociferously opposed to groups like Hamas and think that the Palestinian liberation movement needs to change tack. So people can come from all over the spectrum on this issue. And I think, the protesters, for the most part, especially on college campuses, kind of manifest a lot of those contradictions. I mean, I think a lot of them are probably new to even understanding or caring about this conflict. And some of them are people who are deeply invested in it because they're Israeli or they come from a country in the Middle East or they're Palestinian and they have an actual, personal stake in what's happening overseas right now.
Okay, so I'm glad that we've established this is not always black and white, that it is very nuanced and complicated. At the same time, I'd love to give people an overview of some of the main arguments, as you guys do with your Tangle newsletter, of looking at the left and the right and your take on the reaction to these protests across the political spectrum. Can you give us an idea of what some of the arguments for and against these protests have been?
If you look to the right, the argument there is effectively that what the protesters are doing on campus is so intimidating to many of the Jewish, Israeli, or pro-Israel students that it's hard to be a Jewish student or a pro-Israel student showing up on campus and feeling safe and participating in class and feeling safe when there are people, outside the window of your dorm room chanting for like a global intifada or something like that. So the right sort of understands the free speech argument, I think, that these protesters should be given space to protest, but also feels like we need to ensure that these campuses are safe. They believe that a lot of the students who are protesting are kind of a product of the way that colleges have changed, that administrators and university professors are more liberal. They're more to the left. They're taking students, accepting students into college who tend to have more liberal ideology, and that this is all a product of years of doing that. Then now you have kind of radical, very far left progressive students who are going to participate in protests like this. I think on the left, what you encounter is people who are saying these kids aren't anti-Semitic, they're anti-war, they're not students who hate Jews. There are a lot of Jews participating in these protests. They are just students who fundamentally oppose the things that the Israeli government is doing. I think what you see a lot on the left is arguments about the campuses needing to give these kids the space to protest, to kind of represent what a free speech America looks like and say, look, for the most part, these kids are peaceful protesters and they should be allowed to set up an encampment on campus or hold signs or have guest speakers or do chants. And a lot of people on the left have also suggested that, we don't need these police officers to come in and clear out encampments, that actually the real escalation hasn't been from the students, but it's been from the administrators who are relying on, armed police forces showing up in riot gear to manage what's happening on campus. And the moment that actually has been the real escalation is the way they've tried to shut down or stymie the protests, which has only thrown gas on the fire. And that's generally, I think, the contours of the argument on the right and the left.
So what about the argument that protesters are usually on the right side of history? Plus, we discuss why this conflict is so contentious and personal to many people across not just the U.S., but also the world. But first, a break for our sponsors. Something I've realized about myself over the years is that I do like to talk things out, process what's going on in my life through discussing it, and then I feel better. And while I have great friends and family, I don't want to be constantly talking to them about all my stressors, big and small. But then again, I don't want to keep them bottled up either. That would just lead to more problems. So that's one of the many reasons I appreciate therapy. It's a time to get all the things off my chest, no need to hold back, and then I actually get helpful responses and guidance from a professional. If you're thinking of starting therapy, BetterHelp is an online-only option designed to be convenient and flexible for your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And from there, you can feel it out and switch therapists anytime to make sure you get the right fit for you for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/newsworthy today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/newsworthy. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by Hiya Health. As parents, we always want to do the best we can for our kids. And one easy way that I found to make sure my toddler is getting the nourishment he needs is with Hiya's children's vitamins. Not only does Hiya fill the most common gaps in modern children's diets, but also these vitamins taste great. Or at least my kiddo thinks so because he takes one every morning with enthusiasm. And unlike other options, Hiya is made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy junk. Hiya is designed for kids 2 and up, so I started my toddler on Hiya vitamins right after he turned 2, even before Hiya was a podcast sponsor, and we're still taking them almost a year later. So yes, I was thrilled when they wanted to partner. I also recommend checking out their new Kids Probiotic and Nighttime Essentials. Again, we had started giving my toddler the probiotic a while ago, and he loves it. And I love that I know his body is getting what it needs. We've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. You can receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/newsworthy. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to Hiya, Hiya, health, HEALTH.com/newsworthy and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Okay, now back to our conversation. And there's been some talk about being on the right side of history when it comes to this issue. You recently wrote one of your newsletters about this. So first, explain for us this idea that protesters may be arrested today, but ultimately will be on the right side of history, 50 years from now, and some of the arguments for that and some of the flaws in that.
A lot of people cite, the civil rights protesters, the anti-Vietnam protesters, the anti-Iraq war protesters, and say, look, they were all vindicated in the long term. So odds are you're on the wrong side of history if you're opposed to these protests, which I concede is a good meme. I mean, it's a nice Twitter dunk. But I wrote about this and just said, it's also a little bit ahistorical. I mean, you can look back on a lot of protest movements that were really popular among younger Americans or college students that I think for various reasons have aged poorly. One of the ones that the writer Noah Smith cited was the anti-nuclear protests, which I thought was a great example. If 60 or 70 years ago, we had actually invested in the United States in a huge nuclear energy program, we could be way, way, way ahead in the fight against climate change with much, much, much cheaper energy right now than we have otherwise. And, we've sort of just forgotten about that protest movement because it didn't age particularly well. And we remember all the ones that aged really well. And just because a bunch of college kids are out there protesting doesn't mean they're going to be on the right side of history.
And to be clear, you're not saying they're necessarily wrong, but just we can't say that they're always right.
No, in fact, one of the things I said in my piece is I would actually bet that these protesters, if you take the kind of what I think is one of the core messages, which is the call for a ceasefire, probably will be on the right side of history. But my point is just more that just because that's happened in the past doesn't mean that's always the case.
What do you expect to happen next here in the U.S. with these students now graduating? Do you expect the protest to still continue, or will this fade out? What's your prediction?
My instinct is that things are going to calm down this summer when students leave campus, and maybe that means they'll pick up in earnest in the fall as we head into an election.
Overall, this topic of Israel and Gaza and the Middle East is deeply controversial, deeply personal to a lot of people. I'm sure we both know from experience that no matter what you say or what you report, you're going to upset somebody. What's been your experience, writing so much about the topic? And in general, why do you think this is so divisive and personal to so many people?
It's at the intersection of a kind of, Western versus anti-Western battle. It's at the intersection of the three great Abrahamic religions. It's at the intersection of, a conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that began sort of at the end of the old world era. This is post-World War II, the formation of Israel, when we sort of tried and have tried since to stop forming sovereign nations through war and instead emphasize diplomacy, when the boundaries of the world almost stopped changing in a lot of ways. And all of this stuff, gets these little peppers of different ingredients like anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, or, wars that the United States has participated in, and geopolitical support that the United States gives to certain players in the Middle East. And it invites so many people who have a vested interest in what happens there. The Iranian people care about the conflict in Gaza because their own government has a hand in it and are involved in it. And the Saudis care about it because it's relevant for the Sunni-Shia war. And people in Northern Africa care about it because the Middle East is right there. And refugees might be coming to Egypt if, Palestinians are forced out. All over the world, people have a really strong vested interest in this conflict, and they come to it with very, very different upbringings and perspectives. And I think it's just this big, messy soup of really emotionally charged issues. And now we're witnessing a war in the year 2024, which is very different from a war 60 years ago. One person with an iPhone and an internet connection in Gaza can transport the image of a dead child to the entire planet in a matter of seconds. And that really changes the way people experience the war, which I think just, turns everything up to a level that we haven't ever really experienced before.
Thank you so much to Isaac Saul for sharing his insights and analysis. Be sure to check out the Tangle newsletter to get the best arguments from the right and left on the big political debates of the day. You can subscribe to Tangle at readtangle.com. And the Daily Tangle Podcast is a great option to add to your playlist with the newsworthy if you're looking for a deeper dive into a political topic each day. Of course, join us right here at the Newsworthy each weekday for our regular 10-minute news roundups, where we give you everything from politics to tech to business and entertainment in our fast, fair, fun style. So we'll be back on Monday. Until then, have a great weekend.